Welcome to this video, Exam MS-900 Microsoft 365 Fundamentals. This video is intended to provide you with the skills and knowledge necessary to prepare for and take the Exam MS-900 Microsoft 365 Fundamentals. In recent years, cloud computing has become a popular, if sometimes misunderstood, term. In many ways, the definition of what exactly cloud computing is has become as nebulous as clouds themselves. Despite this, many organizations are considering migrating some or all of their on-premises computing resources to the cloud. Microsoft, like many other software companies, has introduced a number of cloud platforms in the recent years, including Microsoft Azure and Microsoft 365. But understanding precisely what these and other cloud-based platforms do is important to a successful migration. As someone who might be new to cloud computing generally, or to Microsoft offerings more specifically, you might be wondering what each component does. Well, this video seeks to answer these questions and to help you navigate a path towards the MS-900 Microsoft 365 Fundamentals certification by guiding you through the important exam objectives with discussion sessions and hands-on demonstrations. And I'll be your instructor throughout those sessions and demonstrations. I'm a long-time Microsoft certified trainer, and I've taught thousands of students in hundreds of classes over the years. For more than a decade, I've been working with Microsoft on their official curriculum courseware, and I've just completed development on the new Windows Server hybrid curriculum. I've written half a dozen exam ref books for Microsoft Press, including Managing Modern Desktops, Networking with Windows Server, and Identity with Windows Server. Skill 1. In Describe Cloud Concepts, you'll learn about the different types of cloud services available and the benefits of and considerations for using cloud, hybrid, or on-premises services. Skill 2. The skill Describe Microsoft 365 apps and services accounts for around half the exam and is therefore vital to be successful. Here you'll learn about productivity solutions in Microsoft 365, collaboration solutions in Microsoft 365, endpoint modernization, management concepts, and deployment options in Microsoft 365, the analytics capabilities in Microsoft 365. Skill 3. In Describe Security, Compliance, Privacy and Trust in Microsoft 365, you'll learn about the Zero Trust principles for Microsoft 365, Identity and Access Management solutions in Microsoft 365, Threat Protection solutions in Microsoft 365, and Trust, Privacy and Compliance solutions in Microsoft 365. Skill 4. In Describe Microsoft 365 Pricing, Licensing and Support, you'll learn about pricing, licensing options for Microsoft 365, the Microsoft 365 Service Lifecycle, and support offerings for Microsoft 365 services. By the end of the video, you should have learned enough to take the MS-900 Microsoft 365 Fundamentals exam. Microsoft might update the MS-900 Microsoft 365 Fundamentals exam at any time, so it's always good practice to visit the Microsoft website for the latest exam information. I do hope you get as much out of this video as I did writing and recording it. So let's get Lesson 1, Overview. In Understand Cloud Concepts, you learn about cloud fundamentals, including details of cloud services, the advantages of cloud computing, factors that drive organizations to move to the cloud, hybrid working strategies, flexible working strategies, and frontline workers, cloud architecture and cloud service models, the differences between Office 365, Microsoft 365, and Windows 365. Because we're establishing foundational concepts here, there are no hands-on demonstrations. It's a relatively straightforward process to lift and move those servers, virtual machines as they are, from an on-prem hosted environment to a cloud hosted environment. It's often the first move that organizations make to cloud computing. In addition to the storage that's required to start up a virtual machine, virtual hard disks in other words, you'll often need additional storage for other applications that you might be hosting, whether those are server-based or whether they're based around some other technology. Typically, you might, for example, be creating web apps that provide for customer-facing solutions. Those web apps will require access to storage. So cloud computing typically provides the ability to add storage to your applications. That storage can also be accessible to your on-premise users. Databases. If you think about your on-prem network, it may be that you've got a database application that's running on a virtual machine somewhere or other, and that database application hosts information that's relevant to your organization in some way. Now, although you could create a virtual machine in a cloud provider and then install the appropriate operating system on that virtual machine and then install a database application on that and then finally add your specific application and data, you can also take out specific subscriptions for databases so that you don't need to concern yourself with the underlying infrastructure, in other words, the servers themselves. So you can run a database as a solution itself. Software. It's common for cloud providers to provide a software as a service solution. Something like Microsoft 365 does this, where you have a complete solution, and really as an IT professional, all you need to concern yourself with is the user data and supporting your user environment. And the cloud provider takes care of everything else. What are cloud services? Well, as already mentioned, cloud services are internet-based resources. So anybody that wants to utilize cloud resources through a cloud provider will need to ensure that their users have an internet connection. Otherwise, they won't be able to connect to those services. It also raises some issues around about administration. Rather than performing local administration, where you might even have physical access to a file server or to a database on a file server, that's no longer the case. You'll have to use remote management tools, and we'll discuss those through the course. Cloud services are subscription-based, which means you pay for the services that you use as you use them. This has some significant benefits in the case of being able to expand your needs as required. So, for example, if you're a customer-facing retail organization, you know that at certain busy times during the year, you can increase your consumption of certain resources, paying for that increase whilst there's a lot of turnover in your business, and then decreasing the usage when there's less turnover in your business. So you pay for what you use. This is extended into the on-demand access for virtualized hardware, software and applications, and messaging and collaboration platforms. So when you set up a virtual machine, you can specify at a certain hardware level. That's to say the amount of memory that it has, the processor specification, and so on. And then in those busy times, you can increase those requirements, so what we call scaling. Software and applications can be provided. Those software and applications can include fairly fundamental things that you're responsible for managing, or they can be complete solutions where you only have to concern yourself with the data, something like Microsoft 365, for example. Messaging and collaboration platforms, again, I'm going to give you the example of Microsoft 365 with Exchange Online and Teams, providing that messaging and collaboration. In fact, as you start to move to the cloud, the way in which your users are required to work will change significantly, and that's part of that cloud journey. Pay-as-you-go pricing is typical, as I alluded to earlier, so you pay for what you use. When you set up a resource in something like Azure or in something like Microsoft 365, there's an expectation of a certain cost per user or per hour of use. So if you set up a virtual machine, there's an hourly charge for that use. If the machine has more capabilities, in other words, it has more memory, more processor, that will attract a higher cost. Something like a subscription for Microsoft 365 tends to be on a per user basis, typically. So you'll understand that a particular user will incur a particular monthly charge for the services that they use. You might then add additional services to their particular subscription, and that will increase the monthly charge. You can shift licensing around between your users where that proves to be necessary. So you've got a great deal of flexibility in this pay-as-you-go approach. There are many providers. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on Microsoft here, but Google and Amazon and many other vendors also provide cloud services. So there's some common examples of cloud services. Broadly, they fall into a number of different categories. Compute, things like virtual machines. Communications, something maybe like Microsoft Exchange Online or Microsoft Teams. Search engines are very useful in lots of different circumstances within particular applications and throughout your organization. And storage. Why move to the cloud? Well, for every organization, that question is answered in a slightly different way, but most organizations have fairly similar needs. It's important that you understand what the driving force is behind the move to the cloud, not only for your own organization, but also because it's an important aspect on the exam. A typical reason is economy. It's generally felt that you can get economies of scale and more efficiency of resource usage by moving to the cloud, and that's probably true for most organizations. Consolidation. Studies have shown recently that for the most part, we tend to be fairly pessimistic about our resource usage, which is to say that we anticipate we'll need more capacity than we end up actually needing. Consequently, we tend to overbuy. We buy more storage, we buy a higher level of processor, we install more memory in our virtual machines. And as a consequence, it's not efficient. It's typical for a virtual machine to be running at about 40% usage, which means that if you're moving to the cloud, it's a great opportunity to consolidate some of those workloads, to move a workload onto a virtual machine that has spare capacity, to save paying for a second virtual machine, for example. Scalability. The great thing here is that if you've specified a collection of virtual machines to support a particular usage case scenario, and then you find that you've underspecified, it's not a problem because you can add capacity. That's a lot more challenging in an on-prem environment where you'd have to buy additional hardware and configure it and then find actually you've overspecified and now you've got this redundant hardware and software which you've already paid for. So scalability is very flexible in the cloud and is one of the great benefits of making the move. Reliability, that's not to say that somehow an on-prem network is unreliable. It won't be. It's just that you have to plan the high availability and reliability solutions so that you can make sure that you can manage around potential failures and loss of data in a way that's useful to your organization. Manageability. One of the benefits of moving to the cloud is that you have a more consistent set of management tools to manage the various services that you want to use. I mean, that's not to say that something like the Azure portal looks or behaves in exactly the same way as the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, because they don't. But were you to work on one area of Azure, that would probably translate to other areas of Azure fairly straightforwardly. So once you've learned about the interface, then you're probably fairly well equipped to manage other services. So focusing on something like virtual machines and then moving to storage, it's all fairly logical the way that it's put together. And the same is true for Microsoft 365 and for other vendors offering. So manageability is important. Security. With Microsoft 365, Microsoft have already turned on a vast array of security options so that largely your data is already protected. When you're thinking about the way that the cloud works, things change slightly. You're much more focused on the endpoint, which is the device that users use to connect to corporate data. So it might be a cell phone or it might be a laptop or whatever. And those devices become much more significant. I mean, they were never not significant, but they become more significant because you have fewer things to worry about. In an on-prem network, you've got security zones and server hardening and all of those sorts of considerations. That largely goes away when you make a move to the cloud because all those features are turned on by default in your provider's cloud. Infrastructure is the glue that holds everything together. So in your on-prem network, that would be the collection of physical networks connected together to create subnets, connected together via routers and routing tables to create your larger connected end infrastructure. And then connected to that will be physical servers and physical storage components in something like a storage area network. That infrastructure has to be managed by particular specialists. In the cloud, you still have the notion of infrastructure, but much of it is managed by your cloud provider. So although you want to set up a virtual network, you'll need to create a virtual network to host virtual machines. You don't actually have to physically go out and create or connect these physical components together. You merely create a virtual network and the cloud provider takes care of everything else. And moving resources between infrastructure elements becomes a lot easier because everything is virtualized. So the management of that infrastructure is something that becomes much simpler to manage. It's also worth noting that a service like Microsoft 365 doesn't concern itself with the infrastructure at all. That's a software as a service solution. So all you worry about is the data that your users are creating and working with within the context of things like Microsoft Exchange Online and Teams and SharePoint Online and so forth. Machines is not necessary. You don't have any virtual machines. You don't have any physical machines. You don't have a data center potentially. You just have collections of users connected to an environment hosted by somebody else who is responsible for all of those environmental concerns. The network is relatively straightforward now. You just need a connection to the internet, although obviously that connection needs to be secure or secure enough for your organization, and your needs will vary from those of another organization, and they're different for everybody. So you'll need a connection for a user to connect to their Exchange Online mailbox somewhere or to collaborate with Teams. But beyond that, the differences are significant from what you might need to implement in your on-prem network. Redundancy is relatively straightforward to achieve. Again, in the cloud, you can select a level of redundancy and you can change your mind about what redundancy level you want. By redundancy, of course, what I mean is a failover. So if you lose a virtual machine, the workload running on that virtual machine can be taken on by another virtual machine. Now, that virtual machine may be in the same Microsoft data center, or it may be in a completely different Microsoft data center in a completely different region, depending on what you want to do. But you have those options and they're relatively easy to implement and also significantly to change. The skills that you require to manage all of this they're considerable. You still need people that understand about setting up virtual machines and virtual networks and so forth, but they don't need to concern themselves with the minutiae of things like failover and the notion of setting up server clustering and considering how a quorum in a cluster. None of that's necessary anymore. You merely need to think about the fact that you want a level of redundancy and you need to check a particular checkbox somewhere or other to make that happen. So the skill set changes significantly. There are some consolidation benefits which we mentioned earlier on. So as I mentioned, typically servers are underutilized, so you can address that requirement. By using virtualization, you can optimize the usage and implement scaling as and when required. Cloud providers allow you to relatively easily, in fact, very easily, I would say, perform this optimization and scaling. Scalability comes in two sort of flavors. There's scaling up, which is vertical, and there is scaling out, which is horizontal. By scaling up, we mean adding capacity to virtual machines, like adding memory or processor power to a particular collection of virtual machines, and scaling out means adding additional virtual machines to a scale set. And both of those can be configured manually as you need to make a change, or automatically on a scheduled or usage basis. And of course, when a peak in activity is over, you'll want to be able to scale back so you can reduce costs. It's important that all your applications and services are reliable. In an on-prem data center, you require potentially expensive components so that you can get to the level of reliability that you need. So, for example, if a disk fails, then you'll need another disk that holds the same information so that you can continue operating. Typically, you might have a collection of redundant components built in that way. If a server fails, you want to shift the workloads hosted by that server to another server. If a complete data center fails, then you want to switch all of the workloads hosted in that data center to another data center. Each of these has a cost and a complexity built into them. So for example, simple stuff like a backup and recovery, so being able to recover to a file to the latest hour, perhaps, so constant backups are taking place so that if a user overwrites a file inadvertently, we can go back to the one that was an hour old and they've only lost an hour of work, or whatever that value might be. Failover workload, as I said, if a file server fails or a data center fails or a disk fails, you can continue operating. Then you'll need some sort of replication technology to manage all of that. If you've got replication running between data centers, for example, you're going to need a very high-speed network infrastructure to link the elements together. Now, that's going to be expensive for you to host yourself. So in Azure, taking Microsoft Azure as an example, to help with reliability, Microsoft maintains redundant copies of your data with copies located in separate data centers. Azure will provide for automatic failover to a backup server during a particular outage. And this all helps protect against hardware failure by using two separate server instances for your workloads, whether they're located in the same rack or within the same data center or in completely different regions. All management is necessarily remote when you're dealing with the cloud. You don't require physical access. In fact, you don't have physical access, so that's important to remember. It means you have to adjust the way that you've perhaps managed things in the past. Microsoft provide a number of web-based portals which have, I think, fairly intuitive interfaces that you can use to manage the various services to which you subscribe. You can perform the management effectively from anywhere. Obviously, there are certain security concerns if you're using an unsecured network to connect to your services, but that can be mitigated and managed around. So, for example, here we can see the user folder in the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And then we can have a look at the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And in this instance, we're looking at the Rooms and Equipment page. And there are a number of resources shown here. And then finally, we can have a look at the Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center. And that's displaying a list of devices in a particular subscription. All of these are the sorts of management portals with which you might become familiar. All organizations have an interest in security. That will vary from organization to organization, but definitely there is always some requirement to secure content. The provider will handle the physical security. That's to say, access to the data centers and access to the virtual machines and applications and storage that are running within those data centers. That's no longer something that you need to concern yourself with. Although, of course, your users have their endpoint devices, phones and laptop computers and so forth, and those need to be physically secured, and that is still your responsibility, although you can use cloud-based services to manage that aspect of the security solution. Providers offer a number of different security and compliance solutions depending on your needs. So, for instance, in certain regions and countries, there's a requirement to retain data for a period of time, perhaps for accounting purposes. And there's also often a requirement to allow users to access content that relates to them that you store. And again, you can use providers' compliance solutions to adhere to those regulations where that's necessary. So you can see here on the right-hand side the Microsoft 365 Defender portal, which deals with security issues, threat analytics and hunting and incidents and alerts and assets and identities. And you've also got the data loss prevention page being displayed here in Microsoft Purview, which handles things like compliance. So you can set up things like different types of data. So you can use data labeling and sensitivity labels and retention labels. And then you can create policies that apply those different labels in different scenarios. So as data moves around your organization or between your organization and other organizations, you can control the flow of that data as being sensitive and needing to be handled in a particular way in a centralized point. So infrastructure, in an on-premise context, it's wholly your responsibility. So that will be maintaining the physical networks and the subnets and the routing and the connections between your various offices and the connection between those offices and the internet and your customers and your suppliers. All of that's your responsibility. Creating perimeter networks through the use of security zones and firewall technologies. Now, I'm not saying that all goes away. It doesn't. It's just that the focus shifts quite a lot to the cloud. The degree to which it shifts to the cloud, I suppose, depends on how much you want to provide in the cloud, how much management you want to get involved with. Taking Azure as an example, you will need to create virtual machines to host your services, but you won't need to get involved with the infrastructure that actually handles that connectivity. So you define a software instance of a virtual machine and you connect it to a virtual network via a virtual subnet. And then you can interconnect those together logically at the software level, but the physical connections are handled entirely by the provider. You'll still need to maintain some degree of on-prem infrastructure to facilitate connections to the internet because, of course, all of these services are on the internet, so your users will need to be able to connect. Let's talk a little bit about some of the migration scenarios before we move on, just to get an idea about why organizations want to make the move. So in a typical on-premises network, you'll have some sort of authentication provider. In the Microsoft world, that will be Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, sometimes referred to as Windows Active Directory, or sometimes even just Active Directory. You'll have file servers set up for file sharing purposes. It's a very common way of collaborating in an on-premise network. Messaging might be provided by Exchange server or some other third-party messaging solution. And then you may have database applications running on Microsoft SQL Server or some third-party equivalent. There'll also be web apps that might be internet-facing or customer-facing or even user-facing that you use to facilitate internal communications from external users. And there'll be virtual machines and other compute resources within your environment. Now, when you're moving to the Microsoft Cloud, there are a couple of possibilities. There's Microsoft 365, which is, as we'll learn soon, a software as a service solution. So it provides OneDrive, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and Teams, amongst other services. There's Azure, which provides infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, again, as we'll talk about later. So that's things like storage and databases and compute services. And then providing the authentication to all of these is Azure AD, or Azure Active Directory. So typically, I suppose for an organization, a driver might be the need to replace messaging services with something that's easier to manage in the cloud, and that would be a driver for Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 also provides Teams, so you can use that to replace Skype for Business server if you have that in your on-prem context. And OneDrive enables you to provide for file sharing, although not in the same way that a file server might work. For that, you might need to use something like a storage account in Azure and set up Azure Files and Azure File Sync as a mechanism for sharing files and indeed replicating files between your organization's on-prem locations, something maybe we'll talk about later. So the drivers might vary for different organizations, and some might want to make a move wholesale from the on-prem environment in a rapid migration to the cloud, or others might need to operate in what we call a hybrid environment. So in hybrid scenarios, you have your on-prem environment and you have the services provided, in this case by the Microsoft Cloud. That's Azure AD, which provides the authentication, Microsoft 365, which provides a software as a service solution for messaging and collaboration, and then Azure, which provides platform as a service and infrastructure as a service solutions. In these hybrid scenarios, your users will connect to the services at the location where those services reside. So you might host some services in your on-prem context. You might host other services within the cloud. So you'll need to provide a mechanism so that users can connect easily to the appropriate service. So initially, perhaps, for example, you might be running Exchange server in your on-prem environment for messaging, but you may also be providing some users with mailboxes in Microsoft 365 and Exchange Online. So when a user signs in, they must sign in with an identity that provides access to those cloud resources and to those on-prem resources where needed. This is providing a sort of a single sign-on capability. And to do that, you'll need to synchronize your identities between your on-prem environment and the cloud environment to be specific between ADDS and Azure AD. We don't need to get involved in the specifics here, but that notion of identity synchronization and single sign-on is important. So a user signs on and we're able to recognize that their mailbox resides within Microsoft 365. Somebody else signs on and we recognize that their mailbox resides within the on-premise environment. And your organization may operate in this environment forever or for a period of time during the migration to the cloud. It's entirely variable, and you can make the design decision about that as you start your cloud journey. So we can talk a bit about cloud architectures. Cloud architectures, either public or private or hybrid. Let's examine those in a little bit more detail. So in a public scenario, everything runs on your provider's cloud service hardware. There are two types, shared public and dedicated public. In a shared public environment, as you can see, the range of compute services in this example are available in a cloud provider, and each subscriber has access to those resources. So each subscriber is allocated a proportion of the resource available. So subscriber 1, subscriber 2, and subscriber 3. There's no separation between which subscriber accesses which particular resources. They're all shared. That's not to say there's no security separation. It's merely to say that there's no differentiation that subscriber 1 or 2 or 3 has particular collections of resources. Whereas in a dedicated public environment, certain resources are made available for, in this case, subscriber 1, whilst subscriber 2 and subscriber 3 just used from resources from the common pool of available resources. In a private cloud, you create a cloud environment within your own data center. You provide self-service access to compute resources for your users within your own organization. A hybrid cloud, then, is a combination of both public and private clouds. So we're using the same sort of technological and management approach, although some of your resources are hosted in a cloud provider in a public context, and some are hosted in your own data centers in a private context. This enables you to run the apps and store the data in whichever you deem to be the most appropriate location for that app or for that data. Earlier, I used some terms: infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. These are cloud service models. Let's explore those in a little bit more detail now. So infrastructure as a service, IaaS, is the most flexible, and it provides you with complete control. So you're responsible for setting up virtual machines, for example, in something like Azure, and then configuring the operating system, and then defining the characteristics of that virtual machine in terms of its hardware and its storage and how it connects to the networks. And you're responsible for setting up the networking elements as well, to a degree. Platform as a service separates you from some of that complexity. So instead, for example, of running a database by creating a virtual machine on a virtual network that's running a Windows Server operating system that you've installed SQL Server onto, and then installing your database. Instead, you take out a subscription for Azure SQL, which provides that platform for you to run your application, your software application, with your data. So you don't need to concern yourself with the underlying infrastructure, and this is referred to as a platform as a service. There are a variety of platforms or PaaS services that are available through various vendors, depending on your particular needs, but often these are databases or web app type applications. Software as a service provides centrally hosted and managed resources managed by the vendor. Typically, users have access to a particular application. It will always be the same version of the application. A good example of a software as a service solution is Microsoft 365, with its Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, and OneDrive capabilities, plus underlying all of that, an authentication engine provided by Azure AD. And typically all you need to worry about is the user access to that information through the internet and the information itself. So it's pretty important that we understand the difference between these various service models. So I'm going to take an everyday example to try to compare and contrast. Let's imagine you want pizza for your tea. So you start off by going down the homemade route. In that scenario, you're responsible for the dough, the sauce, the cheese, the toppings, cooking the thing in the oven, providing for drinks, crockery and cutlery if you're so inclined, and somewhere to sit to eat the meal. You decide instead to go to the supermarket and buy pre-prepared pizza. In that circumstance, the supermarket, in this case the vendor, has created the pizza, so they're responsible for the dough, the sauce, the cheese, and the toppings. But you take the pizza home, you unwrap it, you put it in your oven, you provide your own drinks. Possibly you bought those at the supermarket, but nevertheless, you provide those drinks. Again, if you feel like it, crockery and cutlery, if you don't want to eat it from the box, and then a table at which you can sit to eat. So some of the responsibility is the vendor's and some of the responsibility is yours. Now down the delivery route now, so you phone through for a delivery of a pizza, and again the vendor is responsible for the dough, the sauce, the cheese, the toppings, and this time they cook the pizza and optionally provide you with the ability to order drinks. So again, all you need now to do is to find somewhere to sit and to eat off. And then finally, the ultimate solution where the vendor manages everything is where you go for pizza at a restaurant. And in this circumstance, you don't need to do anything. The vendor manages every aspect of the pizza preparation and the provision of drinks and cutlery and crockery and a table. All you need to worry about is choosing the appropriate toppings. So let's compare that now to our IT environment. Homemade equates to an on-premise solution. Store prepared is infrastructure as a service. Delivery based is platform as a service. And eating out is a software as a service solution. So how does that relate to IT infrastructure? So your on-premise solution is, as shown here, you start with the network. On that, you attach your storage area network storage. You then connect servers and configure virtualization. For each virtual machine, you need to configure and set up an operating system. Middleware and runtime components sit between the operating system and the applications that you want to run. And then, of course, your users save data into those applications. So everything is provided in that on-prem context by you. In an infrastructure as a service solution, something that Azure can provide, for example, the network, storage, servers, and virtualization is handled in this case by Microsoft, but you choose when you set up a VM the operating system you want to run, so Windows Server, Linux or something, and then you'll set up the middleware and runtime on top of the operating system you've selected, and then you're responsible for installing your apps and managing the data. Platform as a service, something like a database application that you decide to run, you could run that infrastructure as a service by setting up a VM and configuring the operating system, and then the runtime and middleware elements are the database solution that you've chosen. But if you go down the platform as a service solution route, then the vendor is responsible for the underlying network and storage and the servers and virtualization and the operating system that are responsible for managing your app, and indeed the runtime and middleware. What you need to then do is install the actual application on this database platform, or it may not be a database, it may be some sort of web app that's providing some internet connected solution. Whatever it is, you're responsible for just the data and the applications. And then if you're using something like Microsoft 365, which is an example of a software as a service solution, then the only thing that you're concerned with is the data. Everything else is handled by the provider. Okay, what is Office 365? Well, Office 365 is the old name for what's now referred to as Microsoft 365. This can be a little bit confusing because Microsoft 365 used to be the name given to a collection of software functionalities, including Office 365. So we need to forget the older name and just focus on the new name. So Microsoft 365 is what was earlier referred to as Office 365. The Office 365 subscriptions consisted of an Azure AD tenant, which provided for the authentication and identity solution for the cloud apps including Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, and OneDrive for Business. Some client software, that would be Excel and Word. We call that Office 365 Pro Plus client software. And then optionally the Microsoft Store for Business, which was was due to be retired imminently, but it's a storefront which is or can be personalized to your organization. So if you're using Windows 10, Windows 11, there's a store icon that you can run to download store apps, and you can customize and control that by using the Microsoft Store for Business. So that used to be part of Office 365. So what's Microsoft 365? Well, it typically consists of an Azure AD tenant, cloud apps, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, and so forth, just as before, and what we now refer to as Microsoft 365 apps, Outlook, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and OneNote. So rather than calling them Office 365 Pro Plus, they're now Microsoft 365 apps. And Endpoint Manager, which was formerly known as Intune. I still refer to it as Intune often, so I think quite a lot of IT professionals do as well. But Endpoint Manager then is the name of the device management, mobile device management, mobile application management solution within Microsoft 365. The details of what you get will vary based on your subscription. So for example, I've got a very small requirement in my office, a couple of users, and so I'm just using a Microsoft 365 Business Basic. So it doesn't include Intune, for example, and it doesn't include Microsoft 365 apps, but it does include an Azure AD tenant and the cloud apps. So for the exam, you'll need to understand what Windows 365 is. And this is a very interesting feature. As a person who travels to teach, I'm often having to choose whether or not I want to take my laptop with me for the day. I realize that I can pretty much do all I need with a memory stick that contains a slide deck and some hands-on demos that I can do through some Azure virtual machines that are available on the internet in my Azure subscription. But it's quite useful to take my own laptop because it has my own customized version of Windows, which has all of the applications and data on that I use on a day-to-day. Windows 365 offers a hosted version of Windows in the cloud. It's a comparatively new feature from Microsoft. They've provided it in a number of different forms before, but Windows 365 is the name that we use now to describe a Windows in the cloud. The benefit is that a user can sign in anywhere where they have an internet connection from a variety of different client operating systems and gain access to their standardized Windows desktop. So they don't need to take their laptop with them. So they can access wherever they've got internet access, they can access their own personal desktop. And the advantage is for you as an administrator is that you can create a standardized desktop for your whole organization or for discrete and separate divisions within your organization, or indeed for separate departments within your organization, depending on your particular needs. So Windows 365 is a Microsoft cloud-based service. Licensed users are assigned a cloud-based PC. So you can specify the characteristics of that PC much as you can with a virtual machine. So you specify the amount of memory, the amount of storage it has, and the processor specification. So for running Windows 11, for example, you might want to specify quad-core processor. I think Windows 11 requires at least 2 cores. And then 4 gig of memory, that's the minimum. I recommend something like 8. And then a 128 gig SSD would probably be pretty sufficient for most users, more if you need it. So it gives you that capability of assigning a particular level of machine to particular users based on their needs. And the benefits of this is that they're always available wherever you are and you never need to take your laptop with you. So whenever I'm going to teach on site, I don't need to think about taking my laptop. I just need to make sure I've got an internet connection and I can access my standard desktop anywhere. And it provides you with that management benefit. You can easily and centrally, which is key, manage your users' desktops and the app experience that they have. There are 2 editions of Windows 365, Windows 365 Business, and for larger organizations, Windows 365 Enterprise.